The room went quiet the moment the officer stepped forward. Not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful. This was the kind that lands heavy in your chest, the kind that steals the air from your lungs before you even realize you're holding your breath. Shoes stopped shuffling, papers stopped rustling. Even the faint hum of the lights above seemed to fade, as if the room itself sensed what was about to happen and leaned in to watch. The black woman sat alone in the front row, hands folded neatly in her lap, her back straight, her chin level. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't moved. She hadn't done anything that deserved attention. And yet, the officer's shadow stretched toward her like a warning, long and sharp against the polished floor. It crawled up her shoes, touched her knees, rested there like a claim. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice loud enough to cut through the silence. "You need to stand up. Now." Every head turned at once. Phones lifted instinctively, screens glowing like tiny eyes eager for a moment they could replay later. Whispers rippled through the chamber, low and fast, bouncing from row to row like static. People leaned toward each other, lips barely moving, already forming opinions without knowing a single fact. This wasn't some back alley or street corner. This was a public hall, marble floors that shined under bright lights, flags hanging tall and proud along the walls, framed photos of past leaders staring down, frozen in permanent judgment. Authority lived here, power breathed here, and right now it had found a target. The woman looked up slowly, deliberately, as if she refused to be rushed by a man who believed his uniform gave him control over her time. Her eyes were calm, not wide with fear, not burning with anger, just steady, grounded, the kind of eyes that had seen pressure before and survived it. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said. Her voice didn't shake, it didn't rise. It sat right where it was, firm and clear, like a line drawn in the sand. The officer scoffed, a short, sharp sound that carried farther than he probably meant it to, dismissive, almost amused. "Your presence is causing a disruption," he said, as if reading from a script he had used many times before. A disruption. That word hung in the air longer than it should have. Heavy, loaded, familiar. It was a word that always seemed to appear when someone needed a reason, any reason, to justify what they were about to do. A word that made blame feel official. People's eyes moved over her now, openly. They took in her clothes first, simple, clean, elegant in a quiet way. No bold colors, no flashy labels, nothing that screamed for attention, no badge clipped to her jacket, no security detail standing behind her, no entourage whispering in her ear, just a black woman sitting where she was legally allowed to sit, taking up space that apparently made others uncomfortable. The officer shifted his weight, his boots scraping against the marble floor. The sound echoed too loudly in the silence, like punctuation at the end of a threat. He reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, his fingers brushing it with practiced ease. "Either you leave on your own," he warned, leaning closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal, "or I remove you." Her jaw tightened for a brief moment. A small movement, almost invisible unless you were watching closely, but she didn't stand. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't plead or rush to explain herself. She didn't list reasons why she belonged there, didn't point to a ticket or an invitation, didn't search for witnesses to defend her. She simply waited. That choice confused him. You could see it in the way his brows pulled together, in the way his confidence hesitated for half a second. He was used to people responding differently, used to fear, used to quick apologies, used to compliance that came fast and quiet. Around them, the room stayed frozen. Somewhere near the back, someone cleared their throat, the sound nervous and thin. Another person looked down at their shoes, suddenly very interested in the floor. A woman a few seats away shifted uncomfortably, her hands twisting in her lap, her eyes darting back and forth as if she wanted to help but didn't know how, or didn't want to risk it. This was how power worked. It didn't always need shouting crowds or loud orders. Sometimes it only needed silence. Sometimes it only needed everyone else to look away. The officer straightened, taking her lack of movement as defiance. His shoulders squared, his chest puffed out just a little more. Authority, in his mind, was something you displayed. "I asked you to stand," he said again, louder this time. "Last warning." The woman finally looked directly at him, not past him, not through him, right at him. Her gaze didn't challenge him, but it didn't shrink either. It held, and for a moment, something passed between them that didn't have a name. A recognition, maybe, or a test. "I'm listening," she said quietly, "but I'm not leaving." A few gasps slipped out of the crowd before people could stop themselves. Someone whispered, "Oh no," under their breath. Another shook their head slowly, already predicting the outcome. In rooms like this, the ending usually came fast, and it rarely favored someone like her. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced around, aware of the attention now fully locked on him. He was being watched, judged, recorded. But instead of caution, that awareness fed his resolve. He had an image to protect, control to maintain. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice edged with irritation. "Stand up." She didn't move. Seconds stretched. Each one felt louder than the last. The lights hummed again, suddenly noticeable. A phone slipped from someone's hand and clattered softly against the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet. No one laughed. No one smiled. The officer took a step closer, then another. His shadow swallowed hers completely now. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her arm, fingers spread, ready to take. This was the moment, the point of no return. Everyone in the room could feel it. The tension tightened like a rope pulled too far. People leaned forward in their seats, hearts pounding, waiting to see how far this would go. And still, she sat there, calm, composed, as if she had already accepted whatever came next, or as if she knew something no one else did. The officer's hand dropped lower, his fingers brushing the sleeve of her jacket. A touch that wasn't rough yet, but wasn't gentle either. A claim. A warning. "Ma'am," he said through clenched teeth, "stand up. Now." That was when it happened. A sharp crackle burst through the speakers mounted high on the walls. The sudden sound made several people jump. The officer froze, his hand still hovering near her arm. The room collectively inhaled. "Attention, everyone," a voice said over the intercom. The officer straightened immediately, pulling his hand back as if burned. His expression shifted, irritation giving way to forced professionalism. He looked up toward the ceiling, waiting, assuming the announcement was meant for him, that it would back him up, that it would give him the final word. The woman slowly uncrossed her hands and rested them on her knees. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked ready. The voice paused, the microphone picking up a faint breath. That pause stretched, deliberate and heavy, pulling every ounce of focus toward it. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the phone stopped recording, as if their owners were afraid to miss a single word. The officer glanced down at the woman one more time, his jaw set, as if silently telling her this wasn't over, as if reminding her who he believed was still in control. She met his look with the same calm eyes she'd had from the beginning. No fear, no panic, just patience. The voice over the speakers crackled again, about to continue. And in that suspended moment, with the entire room holding its breath, the balance of power trembled. No one knew it yet. No one could see it coming. But something had already shifted. Because sometimes the most important moments don't arrive with noise or force. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on the edge of a sentence, waiting for the right name to be spoken. And whatever was about to be announced next was strong enough to silence the room completely. The announcement paused, hanging in the air just long enough for tension to swell and twist inside every chest in the room. It was the kind of pause that made people shift in their seats, that made hearts beat louder than they should. No one spoke, no one breathed right. The silence felt staged, almost cruel, like the room itself was waiting to see how far this would go. The officer smirked, the corner of his mouth lifting as if the interruption had been planned just for him. He straightened his uniform, slightly, rolling his shoulders back, already convinced this moment belonged to him. "Perfect timing," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This will be quick." He leaned closer to the woman. Too close. Close enough that she could smell the faint bite of coffee on his breath, close enough that his shadow swallowed her completely again. His voice dropped, low and sharp, meant to cut without leaving a mark. "You people always think rules don't apply to you," he whispered, the words sliding out with practiced ease. Quiet enough to sound private, loud enough to sting. Her eyes lifted to his face. For just a second, something flickered there. Not anger, not fear. Disappointment, deep and quiet, the kind that comes when you realize someone has already decided who you are before you ever open your mouth. Around them, the room stayed frozen. No one stepped forward, no one cleared their throat, loudly enough to interrupt him. No one said the simple words that could have changed everything. Power had a way of making people small, of shrinking voices before they ever formed. And the uniform helped. It always did. The speaker overhead crackled again, a faint pop of static cutting through the tension, but the words that followed were drowned out by murmurs spreading through the crowd. People leaned toward each other, whispering like spectators at a show they hadn't paid for but couldn't look away from. "Who is she?" someone whispered, eyes narrowed with curiosity instead of concern. "Why won't she just leave?" another voice murmured, sharp with judgment. "She should have known better," someone else said, shaking their head as if this was all her fault. That was the real injustice. Not the officer's words, not even his posture or his hand hovering near her arm. It was the crowd, the way discomfort turned into blame, the way silence became agreement. The officer straightened again, his patience thinning. He glanced up at the speaker, annoyed that it hadn't finished its message yet, then back down at the woman as if she were an object delaying his day. "I'm done asking," he said. His voice was louder now, meant for the room. "Stand up!" She didn't move. The murmurs grew louder. A ripple of anticipation passed through the seats like a wave. Phones rose higher. Someone near the aisle whispered, "Oh God," under their breath. The officer's jaw tightened. He reached out and took her arm. Firm, public, deliberate. His fingers wrapped around her sleeve, not crushing but claiming. The message was clear. This wasn't a request anymore. This was a display. Gasps rippled through the room, sharp and sudden. A woman in the back pressed her hand to her mouth. A man near the wall shifted uncomfortably, his foot tapping against the floor. Someone whispered, "This isn't right," the words barely louder than a breath. But still, no one moved. No one stepped into the space between power and its target. The woman felt the grip. She felt the weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders. And then, slowly, she stood. Not because he pulled her, not because she was scared, but because she chose to. She rose with control, smoothing her jacket as she did, taking her time as if to remind everyone watching that she still owned herself. When she was standing, she turned and met the officer's eyes, fully, directly, no flinching. "You might want to listen," she said quietly. Her voice didn't carry far, but something about it cut through the noise anyway. It wasn't loud, it wasn't demanding, it was steady, certain, the kind of voice that didn't need permission to speak. The officer laughed, a short, sharp sound that bounced off the marble walls and fell flat. There was no humor in it, just disbelief. "I don't take orders from you," he said, shaking his head as if she'd said something ridiculous. A few people in the crowd nodded along, as if they agreed. Others looked uneasy, sensing the ground shifting beneath them but not yet understanding why. The woman didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pull her arm away. She simply looked past him, toward the ceiling, toward the speakers that had gone quiet again. Her calm unsettled him more than shouting ever could. The officer followed her gaze, irritation flashing across his face. "This is over," he said, tightening his grip just a fraction. "You had your chance." That was when the speaker came back to life. This time the voice was clear, confident, authoritative. It didn't rush, it didn't stumble. It spoke with the kind of ease that came from being listened to. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice said, filling the room, "please remain seated for the arrival of—" The officer froze mid-smirk. His hand loosened without him realizing it. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes lifted slowly toward the speakers, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. Something in the tone had changed, something he didn't control. The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was sharp, alert. Every whisper died instantly, every phone steadied. People leaned forward, sensing a turn they hadn't expected. The officer swallowed. The confidence he'd worn so easily just moments ago cracked, if only a little. He glanced at the woman, then back up at the ceiling, as if silently demanding the announcement hurry up and finish. The voice paused again. That pause did more damage than words ever could. In that silence, the officer's mind raced. You could see it on his face. The calculation, the doubt, the sudden awareness that this interruption might not be working in his favor after all. The woman stood beside him, her arm free now, her posture relaxed. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes forward, waiting, patient, as if she had been waiting all along for this exact moment. People in the room began to sense it too, the shift, the way the air felt different, the way authority seemed to wobble just slightly on its feet. The officer cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This doesn't change anything," he said, but his voice lacked the edge it had before. It sounded thinner, less sure. The woman finally turned her head toward him again. "It changes everything," she said softly. Before he could respond, the speaker continued. The voice spoke the first part of a title, formal and unmistakable, the kind of title that didn't belong to someone you grabbed by the arm. The kind of title that came with power no uniform could outrank. The officer's eyes widened, just a fraction, enough for the people closest to him to notice. Enough to send a ripple through the crowd as heads turned, watching him instead of her now. His grip fell away completely. The woman took a small step forward, free and unbothered, as if the past few minutes had been nothing more than a test she'd already passed. The voice overhead drew a breath, ready to say the name. The room held it with them, and in that suspended moment, with the officer standing frozen and the crowd staring in stunned silence, one truth began to settle in. Power had mistaken her silence for weakness, and it was about to learn how wrong it was. The announcement echoed once. Then again, the words rolled through the chamber slowly, clearly, with no rush and no hesitation, as if they had all the time in the world to land exactly where they were meant to. The chairwoman and principal benefactor of this institution. The sound seemed to strike the walls, the floor, the ceiling, bouncing back heavier each time. Silence followed, sudden and sharp, like glass shattering in a room full of people who hadn't braced for the noise. The officer's grip loosened before he even realized it. His fingers slipped away from her sleeve as if his hand no longer remembered what it had been holding. The color drained from his face, leaving it pale and tight, his jaw frozen halfway open. He looked up at the ceiling speakers, eyes wide, as though they had betrayed him personally. Just moments ago, he had owned the room. Now the room no longer belonged to him at all. The woman didn't look at him, not yet. She turned instead toward the crowd, toward the rows of faces that had watched her in silence, judged her without knowing her, measured her worth by how little space she took up. She faced them calmly, shoulders relaxed, posture steady, as if this had always been her place to stand. Every eye locked onto her now, not out of curiosity but recognition. Phones lowered slowly, forgotten in trembling hands. Breaths were held, shallow and careful, as if making noise might somehow undo what had just been said. The murmurs that had filled the room minutes earlier vanished completely. There was nothing left to whisper about. The truth had arrived. She adjusted her jacket with a small practiced motion, smoothing the fabric at her cuffs. It was a simple gesture, almost ordinary, but it carried weight now. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, carrying easily through the silence. "You can let go now." The officer stumbled back a step, as if pushed by the words alone. He released her fully, his hand dropping uselessly to his side. Only now did he seem to realize how many people were watching him. 100 witnesses, maybe more, all eyes on the man whose authority had just cracked in public. His chest rose and fell too fast. His badge, once a source of pride, felt heavier than it ever had before. From the side of the room, a man in a tailored suit rushed forward, his polished shoes tapping sharply against the marble floor. Panic flashed across his face, the kind that came from understanding a mistake too late. "Ma'am," he said quickly, his voice strained, We didn't know you had arrived early." She turned her head, slightly toward him, and nodded once. No smile touched her lips. No hint of triumph or satisfaction crossed her face. There was no need for it. "I prefer to observe quietly," she replied. "It tells me everything I need to know." Those words landed harder than any accusation could have. The man swallowed, nodding again, already backing away as if afraid to take up more of her time. Behind him, the officer tried to speak. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He cleared his throat once, then again, but the words stayed trapped inside. Whatever apology or excuse he had prepared moments ago no longer fit the moment. There was no space for it. Screens around the room flickered to life, one by one, lighting up the walls with images and text. Her name appeared in bold letters. Her face, captured in professional photos, confident and composed. Lines of text followed, detailing a legacy that stretched far beyond this room. Billions in investments, endowments that had funded entire programs, scholarships that had changed lives, buildings that carried her name, not as decoration, but as proof of her impact. A soft wave of recognition rolled through the crowd. Gasps slipped out, heads bowed. The same people who had judged her clothes and her silence just minutes ago now avoided her gaze, suddenly aware of their own smallness. Some stared at the floor. Others stared at the screens, as if reading her story again might excuse the way they had treated her before they knew who she was. She didn't look back at the screens. She didn't need to. She stepped forward toward the podium, heels clicking against the marble floor with measured confidence. Each step echoed through the room, not loud, but steady, marking the distance between who she had been moments ago in their eyes and who she had always been. When she reached the podium, she rested her hands lightly on its edge and looked out over the room. The silence that greeted her was complete. No coughs, no whispers, no movement. She had their full attention now, not because of fear, but because of truth. "Today," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I watched how power behaves when it thinks no one important is watching." Her eyes moved slowly across the crowd, meeting faces one by one. Some people shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. Others nodded faintly as if acknowledging a lesson they hadn't expected to learn. Her eyes briefly met the officer's. Just a second. Long enough for him to feel seen in a way he never had before. Long enough for the weight of his actions to settle fully on his shoulders. "And I was not impressed," she continued. The words weren't loud, they weren't sharp, but they cut deeper than shouting ever could. The officer's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining out of him. In that moment, he wasn't an enforcer or a symbol of authority. He was just a man who had made a choice and now had to live with it. Around the room, something shifted. People began to understand that what they were witnessing wasn't just a reveal, it was a reckoning. Dignity had rewritten the rules right in front of them, not with raised voices, not with threats or demands, but with truth spoken plainly and without apology. She straightened, her hands still resting on the podium. "This institution exists to serve the public," she said. "All of it, not just the parts that look familiar or feel comfortable." Her voice remained steady, but emotion flickered beneath it now. Not anger. Resolve. Respect should not depend on titles, uniforms, or assumptions. It should be given freely because it is owed. The crowd listened, rapt. Some nodded, some wiped at their eyes, others sat very still, absorbing the weight of her words. They weren't just hearing a speech, they were seeing themselves reflected in it. She stepped back from the podium and turned once more toward the officer. He stood straighter now, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. His eyes were downcast, his jaw tight, the confidence he had worn earlier completely gone. He looked smaller somehow, not because she had risen above him, but because he had fallen short. "This isn't about punishment," she said, her voice softer now. "It's about learning. It's about doing better when the moment comes again." He nodded, finally finding his voice. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. She gave a small nod in return, then turned away. The room remained silent as she walked past the front row, past the same seat where she had sat moments ago. Unnoticed and unprotected. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a clear path for her. This time, no one blocked her way. No one questioned her presence. As she reached the exit, the weight of the moment lingered behind her. People sat frozen, replaying the scene in their minds, realizing how quickly they had chosen sides, how easily they had mistaken silence for weakness and authority for righteousness, because the truth was simple, and it settled heavily in the air long after she left. Power doesn't always announce itself when it enters a room. Sometimes it sits quietly in the front row, waiting to see how it will be treated. And when dignity finally speaks, it doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. The officer stood at attention, but not the way he had before. Not stiff with confidence, not puffed up by the weight of his uniform. He stood smaller now, stripped down to something human. His shoulders were tight, his hands held too still at his sides, as if any movement might shatter what little control he had left. The room watched him the way people watch someone exposed to a truth they can't run from. "I apologize," he said at last. His voice cracked on the word, betraying the effort it took just to say it out loud. "I made a mistake." The sound of his apology didn't echo the way his earlier commands had. It didn't fill the room. It hovered there, fragile, waiting to see if it would be accepted or rejected. She looked at him carefully, not with anger, not with triumph, and not with cruelty. Her gaze was steady and clear, the kind of look that didn't rush to judgment but didn't avoid it either. She took a breath, letting the moment stretch just long enough for everyone to understand that this wasn't about embarrassment. This was about truth. "No," she replied softly. "You made a habit." The words landed gently, but their impact was heavy. A quiet wave moved through the room as people absorbed what she meant. A mistake could be brushed off. A habit demanded reflection, accountability, change. The room exhaled as one. You could hear it, a collective release of breath, of tension, of something that had been sitting in people's chests since the first command was given. The air felt lighter, but sharper too, like the moment after a storm when the ground is wet and everything smells new. She turned from the officer and faced the crowd. Faces that had once watched her in silence now stared back, attentive and uneasy. Some people leaned forward, others sat perfectly still. All of them were listening now. "Too often," she said, her voice calm but firm, "respect is given based on titles, not humanity." She paused, letting the words sink in. Today proved how dangerous that is. No one interrupted her. No one checked their phone. Even the smallest sound seemed to disappear, as if the room itself understood that this was a moment worth honoring. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice to claim authority. She didn't demand the officer's job or call for punishment driven by anger. That would have been easy, expected even. Instead, she chose something harder, something that would last longer than the moment. She demanded accountability, not in vague promises, not in quiet conversations, behind closed doors. She spoke clearly, outlining what responsibility would look like: an internal review, mandatory retraining, a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing so that the lesson wouldn't disappear once the crowd did. Each word was measured, each demand rooted in the belief that systems don't change unless people are forced to look at themselves. The officer listened, his head bowed slightly now. With every requirement she named, his expression shifted further away from defense and closer to understanding. The uniform still hung on his shoulders, but it no longer shielded him from the weight of what he had done. When she finished, she turned back to him, not as an enemy, not as a conqueror, but as a teacher standing in front of someone who had just failed an important test. "Learn from this," she said. Her voice softened, but it didn't lose its strength. "Because the next woman you disrespect may not have a microphone to correct you." That was the truth no one could argue with. The room felt it. The officer felt it. His throat tightened as he nodded, the movement slow and sincere. There were no words left for him to say. Anything more would have cheapened the moment. For a heartbeat, the silence returned. But this time it wasn't heavy or sharp. It was reflective, thoughtful. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single clap broke through, soft, hesitant. Another followed, then another. The sound grew, spreading through the room until applause filled the space. It wasn't loud at first. It didn't explode. It built slowly, like understanding taking shape in real time. This wasn't applause for revenge. It wasn't celebration at someone's downfall. It was recognition, respect, justice. She stood there for a moment, letting it pass over her without soaking it in. She didn't bow. She didn't wave. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the sound without feeding on it. Then she stepped away from the podium. As she walked off the stage, the same crowd that had judged her clothes, her silence, her presence now stood. Not all at once, not perfectly, but they stood. Some out of respect, some out of guilt, some out of realization. No one spoke. No one needed to. The officer remained where he was, watching her go. His world felt different now, smaller maybe, but clearer. He had been seen. And more importantly, he had been corrected in front of the very people who once watched him misuse his power. She moved through the aisle slowly, her footsteps steady. No one blocked her path this time. No one questioned where she was going. The space opened for her naturally, the way it always should have. As she reached the exit, she paused for just a moment. Not to look back, not to check who was watching. Just long enough to let the weight of what had happened settle into the walls, the floor, the air itself. Because the lesson wasn't just for the officer. It wasn't just for the crowd. It was for anyone who had ever mistaken authority for righteousness. For anyone who had ever stayed silent because speaking up felt inconvenient. For anyone who had ever judged a person's worth before knowing their name. Power doesn't always announce itself when it enters a room. Sometimes it sits quietly, waiting to see how it will be treated. Dignity doesn't need permission to exist. And the true measure of a person isn't who they control or how loudly they command a space, but how they treat those they believe are powerless. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the power, and sometimes the loudest lesson doesn't come from shouting or force, but from a single moment of truth that no one can ignore.